Hello, my name's Mark Fernandez, and this is Franchising with Fernandez. And our special guest today is Dr. Michael Schaper. Now, Dr. Schaper has been charged with independently reviewing the Australian Franchising Code and his subsequent report, which was released in December 23. Good morning, Dr. Schaper.
Morning, Mark. Pleasure to be here with you.
Great. And Michael, let's just get straight into it if we can. So, why did we have to have an independent review into the franchising code?
Well, every piece of delegated legislation under federal law needs to be reviewed approximately every 10 years. So, first up, it was almost an existential question: do we still need a code? In addition to that, in the last couple of years, there have been some specialised changes, particular rules for new motor vehicle dealers, the introduction of a franchise disclosure registry nationally, and each of those also was up for assessment as well after having been in place for about a year or two. So in effect, two or three issues all bundled together, but all of them about the franchising regulatory framework and where next for it.
Great. And that review and your subsequent report issued 23 recommendations, if I'm not mistaken.
It did. It did. We went through a whole host of them. Some of them were quite technical, for example, small tweaks, but there were some big issues there. And let me just call out a couple of key
Please.
ones that I think are important for everyone in the franchising community. A very first one was to say, well, we actually need to define why the code exists. We've had it for, in one form or another, for almost a quarter of a century, but we've never clearly articulated, is it meant to resolve all disputes? Is it meant to simply provide a guide for best practice? Is it meant to cover all franchising situations, or is it meant to just be a basic bedrock upon which franchisors and franchisees do their own relationships? So we need to spell out that. We spent a bit of time assessing also the performance and satisfaction in the industry with the regulators. We suggested also that for the first time, the government needs to collect and publish, as they did in this review, comprehensive statistics about the sector. Two critical ones that were made were to suggest that in future the code needs to make sure that franchisors give their franchisees a reasonable opportunity to make a return on their investment. And we've also floated the idea of moving from basically a highly legalistic framework to a much more industry based one, moving from basically black letter law to a licensing regime, which is I'll talk about in a little bit in a minute. But they're pretty substantive ones. And then there are a whole host of other issues. The key issue is keep the code, but let's make some changes to it.
Okay, great. So now let's ask the million-dollar question. If I'm a franchisee, and we'll talk about some of these recommendations as we go, but I'm a franchisee. How does this affect me? Does it affect me, and will it see any material changes in the way I do things?
Well, for most franchisees, if you've got a good relationship with your franchisor, I suspect that many of these will take a long time to percolate through, as they should, because the whole purpose behind having regulation is to make sure that franchising works as an industry, that new innovative franchising systems are encouraged along, but also that existing franchisors and franchisees can work mutually. If you've got a good franchise system with the right culture already, that's not going to be an issue for you. It's going to be more probably noticeable for people who are either in disputes or whose relationship is perhaps a little bit more rocky. You should, though, also expect some of our other suggestions. For example, consolidate all of the franchising information the government puts out online into one place, a so-called like a franchise smart website, or a one-stop shop online. That will probably be a little bit more immediate. And if you're looking to find out or invest in a new franchise system, then some of our suggestions about improving the franchising disclosure registry should also see some immediate or short-term rather gains. It still has to go through the machinery of government. Government's accepted all the recommendations. They've put $3 million into the federal budget to implement them. And now, of course, the process of implementation will take some time. There will be some laws to enact, but there will also just be some administrative things. And those things always take time.
Okay, great. And can I talk specifically around the end of term, I guess, and the relationship? If I'm still wearing my franchisee's hat, the views around how do I exit, what are my roles, obligations, and why we even need to be talking about this.
Look, it's a very interesting one that, despite the fact that the code has been around for 25 years and most of the elements that we've got in there today have been in existence roughly in some way, shape, or form all that time. Some issues keep coming up, and end of term is a classic one, Mark. So, for example, there is still a very strong feeling a lot of franchisees that I'm entitled to a goodwill payment, for example, and yet both recent court cases like the Mercedes-Benz decision within the last 2 years, as well as provisions of the code. For example, it's been a long-running requirement in the code that franchisees, when they sign up, have to sign up to a statement saying that they've taken independent advice and they know what the code and what their contract has in there. And yet still many times the grievances are that I don't get, for example, an end of term payment. And yet most franchise agreements quite legally are very clear about this is a fixed term contract, and whether we renew it or not is a separate issue. And so in some respects, one of the suggestions that I put forward was each franchise agreement needs to give franchisees a reasonable opportunity to make a return, is hopefully designed to address that as well. So that's a key element there. And as you can see, my dog in the background agrees very strongly with it as well.
There you go. There you go. Oh, and look, there are other mechanisms for franchisee disputes. Talk about the mediation and dispute resolution processes. That's also going to get a bit of a tweak under your recommendations.
Well, look, there can be a big picture and a small picture here. So, small picture, we've made some suggestions. For example, the small business ombudsman, under the proposals in this reform package, would have a franchise concierge service. They'd be able to provide a bit of a walkthrough for franchisees about how to get your dispute resolved. They could also act as a super complainant if there was a whole group of franchisees in the in the same industry or the same firm, and they wanted basically all have the same complaints. So there are small things like that. The biggest issue, Mark, is the proposal originally put forward by the regulator of the sector at the moment, the ACCC, and that is that perhaps what we need to have is an independent dispute settlement process rather than a highly court-based one. At the moment, if the law is broken, someone raises it with the ACCC gets almost 500,000 complaints every year. They get funded to run 20 or 30 court cases across everything that they do, not just in franchising. And as a
Yes.
result, only a handful, if that, each year are the resources available to prosecute a case. A court case takes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, if not sometimes into millions. It takes a year or two to resolve, and it only can deal with the letter of the law as it stands. What the licensing regime proposes, and what we already do in a number of other industries, telecommunications, financial services, gas, electricity, and water bills, is to have a licensing regime where we have effectively an industry, a consumer and industry led dispute resolution process is much more focused on fixing the problem rather than tonking it out in court over the letter of the law. And so if that is to come to pass, then I think that holds a huge amount of benefit for all sides of the party. It would mean that franchisees would have an opportunity to have any grievances raised, but more importantly also, franchisors would also have, through their representative bodies, a chance to participate in what are the rules. At the moment, the rules are made by Parliament, they take years to change, and then they take further years to be tested in the courts. So what we're talking about is a much more flexible, adaptive, industry-led system that could potentially also move much more quickly. So I think that is a big change if it comes about, Mark. So let me give you a really simple example. If you have a small complaint with your bank, because I've been overcharged by $2, you don't ring up ASIC as a financial services regulator. You talk to the Financial Complaints Authority, and they can usually resolve most of those things very, very promptly. The regulator sits in the background in case it turns out that 25 million Australians have all been overcharged, in which case there's a systemic issue. But they don't want to spend their time resolving that. You don't want to do that, and the banks don't want to do it. So I think there are gains all the way around.
Yeah, sure. And Michael, you talk a little bit about licensing. My understanding is there's going to be a separate subcommittee set up to deal with the licensing recommendations. Can you talk us through where that stemmed from and why we think we need to have a special review or a special segment of licensing separate to the franchising, I guess, regulatory system?
I think that's a really important point to make clear, Mark. It doesn't sit separate to it. In fact, it sits on top of it, so that not suggesting the existing laws be removed, but that in practice, most of them can be done through a licensing regime. So a licensing regime would sort of say, are you complying with the code? And if not, let's resolve the dispute here rather than go to the ACCC. That would make everyone's life a lot easier. You would be able to ring up and usually within a couple of weeks, if that, hopefully get some sort of resolution. That's the sort of time frame that many of the other dispute resolution schemes work on. So it's not another piece of regulation. It is basically leaving the ACCC with those powers that it has, but it's not going to be asked every day, are you going to pick me as one of your 400,000 or 500,000 complainants that you're going to investigate? What you're going to do is bring up a dedicated service who'll be able to look at it. And likewise, though, the rules about what sits in the licensing system in each of those other industries, telcos, as I mentioned, financial services, utilities, disputes, it's usually made up of a combination of industry representatives, consumer representatives, so you can see the parallel, franchisee, franchisor representatives, and an independent chair as well. So between them, and a requirement that decisions have to be made by either a supermajority or by consensus. So the purpose of the review, having put that forward in the recommendations of my review, it's now up to government, and the Federal Treasury will be looking at how would we do this in practice. So I've painted the big picture, but I haven't gone down to, the nth level mark in terms of here's how every tiny element. I think there is a lot of talking with the industry to be done about. There's talking with franchisee organisations as well, and also working out what is practical in the day-to-day sense as well. But I would say this: it is going to be the one opportunity in which the franchising sector, if it steps up to the challenge, will have the capacity to say we are going to, in future, be able to help shape the regulations under which we work. At the moment, you don't shape them. Parliament shapes them, the regulator shapes them, the courts shape them, and then whenever you get an unsatisfactory outcome, then years and years, which is why you have reviews like mine to work out where the shortfalls are. And I think we can work a little bit more flexibly than that. But the industry needs to step up and show that it's interested, because otherwise you will stick with a highly legalistic, highly expensive framework.
Yes.
And if that's where people want to go, that's fine. But I think you're not going to get another chance, this having been flagged, the reviewer having said it, the regulators having said, we think this is a smarter way to operate. So that, I think the line they keep using, we don't want to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff.
No.
This is famously the line. We don't want to pick up the bits when it doesn't work anymore. And the licensing regime would also allow us perhaps to have more general rules about, for example, what's a fit and proper person to run a franchise system, so that we don't end up with any shonks in the system as well.
Yes.
I don't say that we have them, but we want to make sure we don't get them in.
Yeah, true. And Michael, shifting to the franchisor now, under these recommendations, what should we be doing, or what should we be looking out for if I'm a franchisor or a representative?
Right. Well, with some of these changes will take a while to enact. So I think the first one is to I think there's two elements. First one is to stay alert to the changes as they come through, and bodies like the ACCC do make a reasonable effort to communicate that information out through things like information networks and such like, and through consultancy services like the ones that yourself and others provide as well. They're all important, I think. The second one, though, is also through franchise or bodies, and there's a couple of them around, is also to make sure, like, the Federal Treasury is still trying to work out how to do these. This is our chance to actually have our say before. Not much point coming back and going, I don't like the final product. You're in the grey zone now. The reviewer has made suggestions. The government has said, we'll take them on in principle. Now is the point in which principle becomes practice. So here is the time to actually think about, what is my industry body doing to actually make sure we have a say in how that looks and works.
Great. And my understanding after talking with Rod Sims, the Deputy Chair of the ACCC, the consultative committee will be formed to deal with some of these licensing issues, and the time frame is around about September, October. They hope to get an exposure draft out for all the industry to consult and provide that feedback, and hopefully towards the end of the year, some of the recommendations might get looked at and addressed. So that's my understanding of the timeframes. Do you have any other insights or tips or trips or anything
Well, not
on your review?
well, unfortunately not. The reviewer's purpose in this is to make the reviews
Sure.
and to then step aside and let government put them in. As you said, Mick Keogh is, as Deputy Chair, there has spent a lot of time, and they will be in the thick of it.
Yes.
But that sounds about an approximate timeframe. And bearing in mind that we're going into a federal election next year,
Yeah.
I think it's important that we try and get some things through before the end of the year or early in the new year. I get the sense that the government is keen to do things. We've certainly got an excellent minister in Julie Collins who's got a strong interest in this, and I've been quite pleased with the level of support and an open mind in which government has brought to it. So let's see what happens next.
Yeah, great. Sorry, my apologies. Mick Keogh is the man in the Deputy Chair hot seat at the moment. So he's got a lot going on there too. So yes, all right, there you have it. Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest today, Dr. Michael Schaper, our independent reviewer of the franchise code. We hope to hear back from you a little bit later in the year, Dr. Michael Schaper, and hopefully you can provide some more insights.
A pleasure, Mark, as
Wonderful.
always.
Thank you
Cheers.
very much and have a wonderful day. Thank you and bye
Thanks.
for now.